Hello everyone, welcome to The History, and subscribe my channel.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we are taking a really hard look at a globally recognized icon. I mean, we all know the face, but right now we're going to unpack the actual reality of Ernesto Che Guevara. You've seen his face on t-shirts, dorm room posters, coffee mugs, everywhere. It is practically inescapable, right? But who is the actual flesh and blood man behind the world's most famous piece of merchandise? Today we are going to look strictly at the historical records so we can separate that legendary myth from his actual lived reality.
Part 1. The Radicalizing Road Trip.
So, think about it. How does a comfortable, upper-class Argentine medical student become a radical Marxist? Well, he wasn't exactly born a guerrilla fighter. It really all started out on the open road. Let's trace this timeline together. During his incredibly famous motorcycle treks across the continent in the early 1950s, Guevara came face-to-face with just profound, crushing poverty. Imagine the total culture shock. He's seen miners literally freezing without blankets, and peasant farmers working these tiny plots of land they could never even hope to own. After returning home to finish up his medical degree, he heads to Guatemala in 1954. And it's there, watching the CIA actively assist in overthrowing a democratically elected president, that his anti-imperialist worldview was permanently cemented. For Guevara, the diagnosis was suddenly crystal clear. Armed struggle was the only cure. He wrote that the highest forms of human solidarity and loyalty arise among lonely and desperate people. Notice that specific word he uses, solidarity. His time spent treating leper colonies in Peru sparked this really deep desire to cure societal ills rather than just physical ones. He started looking at Latin America not as a collection of separate borders drawn on a map, but as a single, massive entity that required one unified liberation strategy.
Which brings us to Part 2, Commanding the Cuban Revolution.
Okay, so this leads directly to a very fateful meeting with Fidel Castro over in Mexico. And the plan they hatched? Honestly, it was bold, borderline reckless. They sailed to Cuba on this leaky, completely overcrowded cabin cruiser called the Granma. They were almost entirely wiped out the second they landed and had to flee deep into the Sierra Maestra Mountains just to regroup. But you know what? In that harsh jungle, Guevara absolutely thrived. He quickly rose up to second in command, earning a fierce reputation for absolute competence and brilliant tactical maneuvering. Eventually, he led an outnumbered rebel force to a decisive, war-winning victory at the Battle of Santa Clara. But it's during this specific campaign that a pretty stark duality in his character really emerges. We have to look at this impartially. The exact same commander who was painstakingly building ovens to bake bread and constructing schools to teach illiterate farmers to read was also the man who ruthlessly executed informants and deserters without a second thought, just to maintain rigid discipline. He actually kept a diary out there in the jungle, and it reveals a rapidly hardening detachment to violence. Just listen to the incredibly clinical, matter-of-fact way he records taking a life here with a .32 pistol. It really goes to show just how deeply the brutal, everyday realities of the guerrilla war had fundamentally altered his psyche.
Moving on to Part 3, Power and the New Man.
So what actually happens when a rebel force finally takes power? Well, transitioning from a gritty rebel force to an actual governing body brought on entirely new, heavy responsibilities. In Havana back in 1959, Guevara was put in command of the La Cabaña fortress. And here, the scales of revolutionary justice moved incredibly fast. He oversaw tribunals and firing squads that resulted in an estimated 55 to 105 executions of former Batista officials. To Guevara, this wasn't just mindless revenge. He saw it as an absolute necessity to secure the revolution and prevent the public from engaging in chaotic mob vigilantism.
And then, talk about a culture shock. The rugged guerrilla fighter was unexpectedly promoted to finance minister and head of the central bank. And in a move that totally shocked the global financial world, he signed the newly printed national currency with just his casual nickname, Che. It was a highly deliberate, honestly almost mocking gesture, signaling his profound, deep-seated disgust for capitalist wealth and the class distinctions that money created. And that little signature perfectly illustrates his ultimate kind of utopian goal, the creation of El Hombre Nuevo, or the new man. He literally wanted to completely eradicate human selfishness.
Through massive volunteer labor programs and strict centralized state control, he envisioned a brand new society, where workers were motivated purely by moral solidarity and certificates of commendation. He wanted to entirely eliminate the desire for any individual material gain.
But as you might guess, transforming basic human nature proved incredibly difficult. His highly accelerated industrialization plans were largely unsuccessful. Productivity plummeted, which actually forced the introduction of strict food rationing. Meanwhile, on the international stage, his intense anti-US stance made him a key architect in bringing Soviet nuclear missiles directly onto the island. And that was a move that pushed the entire globe to the absolute brink of nuclear war during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
Which leads us right into Part 4, Final Campaigns and Death. By 1965, he was growing deeply dissatisfied with the Soviet Union and was eager to spread the armed struggle globally. So Guevara suddenly just disappears from his government posts in Cuba. But his first covert campaign in the Congo was a complete, utter disaster. It was plagued by local infighting, a total lack of fighting spirit among the rebels, and intercepted communications by the CIA. He was eventually forced into a retreat. He actually opened his diary for that specific campaign with a staggeringly blunt sentence: "This is the story of a failure."
Next, he moves on to Bolivia in disguise, hoping to spark a fresh insurgency. But man, his final campaign crumbled rapidly. Basically, everything went wrong. Malfunctioning shortwave radios left his troops completely and totally isolated. On top of that, he received absolutely zero support from the local peasantry or the Communist Party. All the while, he was being actively hunted down by highly trained, US-assisted Bolivian Rangers.
He was finally captured on October 8, 1967, and held overnight in a dilapidated little schoolhouse. The very next day, staring down a hesitant Bolivian executioner, he delivered his famously defiant final words: "Shoot, coward. You're only going to kill a man." He was executed at just 39 years old. But honestly, in that exact moment, the martyrdom had already begun.
Bringing us to our final section, Part 5, A Polarizing Legacy.
Right after his death, post-mortem photographs were released to the press just to prove he was actually dead, but it totally backfired. Because his body was displayed on a concrete slab, the world immediately started comparing the images to classical paintings of Christ. Meanwhile, back in Cuba, Fidel Castro delivers this incredibly powerful eulogy to a crowd of 1 million mourners, essentially demanding that children be educated in chaste spirit. This fueled a massive, worldwide narrative that largely ignored his failed economic policies and brutal wartime tactics, painting him purely as a selfless, untarnished visionary for the youth to emulate.
And that is exactly why today we are left with two sharply contrasting figures. To the political left, he is deeply revered as a heroic defender of the oppressed, a selfless symbol of youth rebellion and egalitarianism. To the political right, particularly among exiled communities, he is vehemently reviled as an authoritarian, cold-blooded executioner. As we've seen looking through the history today, the historical record holds undeniable elements of both of these realities.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty profound irony to chew on. How does an uncompromising, lifelong enemy of capitalism end up as a ubiquitous, highly commodified pop culture logo? His face is literally relentlessly manufactured and sold for profit everywhere in the world. So what does the extreme commercialization of this specific man tell us about history? And maybe more importantly, what does it tell us about ourselves? Thanks so much for joining us for this Explain.